Hey guys, how you doing? Luna here with a new video. Welcome back to the channel. Today I have a new episode of the Versus series, and honestly, this is a video I don't really want to do. Dude, I can't help but feel like this video shouldn't exist because Bob Dylan's relationship with George Harrison is one of the most wholesome things that has come out of the music industry. Like, George Harrison loves the guy. They have such an admiration for each other that facing them off against each other just feels wrong. Dylan was one of the only people in Harrison's life that encouraged him to do more music, to create more, and to release his own solo stuff, you know, even if it meant having to leave the Beatles. But actually, it is because they inspired each other so much that this video makes perfect sense. So today I bring you, even if it's a little bittersweet, Bob Dylan versus George Harrison. Now, if you guys follow the channel and you've seen any other episode of the Versus series, if you haven't, then go ahead and check them out. We use 4 different categories to pick a winner at the very end of the video. These 4 categories are popularity, influence, performance, and discography. Based on the point given in each category, by the very end of the video, the one that has more points will be the winner. I would like to make sure you guys understand that this is only my personal opinion, so if you guys have your own, and I'm pretty sure you do, you can go ahead and leave it down below in the comments, and I'll make sure to read it and give you my opinion on your opinion. I don't really want to make this intro too long, so let's go with the first category, popularity. Alright, so in the very first category, things are already kind of complicated because we have a former Beatle in here, right? So that means that the answer, there's simply no straight answer. It's going to depend on the time. If we're talking about the 60s, nothing was bigger than the Beatles, and that includes George Harrison. But then after we go in the 70s and 80s, things changed. Bob Dylan was way more popular. Because after the Beatles were no more, George Harrison's popularity flopped quite a bit. I mean, you have All Things Must Pass, his best-selling album selling 7 million copies, being released in the midst of the Beatles breaking up, you know, and then you have the other really popular George Harrison album being Cloud 9 in 1987, I believe, selling only over a million copies in the US, you know, which is impressive. You know, it's good, but it's nothing compared to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's popularity was massive in the 60s and the 70s. When it came to the 80s, I think he didn't manage to adapt to the new era of music all that well. However, we still have some amazing albums that sold well over a million copies, like Oh Mercy, for example. Then you jump into the 90s and the 2000s with the greatest comeback of all time, with albums like Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft, and Modern Times. Those albums sold pretty well and are really well known as great pieces of music of the last decades. So the answer should be easy, but it's not really, because again, like, the level of popularity the Beatles enjoyed in the 60s mean that everyone knows who you're talking about when you say George Harrison, even outside the US. You know, if you go to South America and you ask people about George Harrison, they're most likely going to know who you're talking about. Instead, when you leave the English-speaking populace in the world, you know, they don't really know who Bob Dylan is, and that is a huge difference, you know, so I don't really know who to give the point here in this category, but ultimately I think that because Dylan managed to maintain his popularity throughout a bigger time span, well, George Harrison's popularity kind of relied very heavily on the fact that he was a Beatle, out of which he was the least popular Beatle, by the way. It was Paul, Ringo, John, and then George Harrison. So I think it would be safe to say that I can't give this point to George Harrison based on his time with the Beatles. So Bob Dylan takes the point, basically, because yes, a lot of people outside the US and outside the UK, in places where they don't even speak English, know who George Harrison is, but they know that because of the Beatles, not really because of George Harrison. In terms of sales, after the Beatles were no more, Bob Dylan mops the floor with George Harrison. So yeah, he takes a point in this category. I mean, this category is kind of silly, honestly. When it comes to these two, I don't know anyone that can say that George Harrison is more influential than Bob Dylan with a straight face. And if you actually believe that, you need to have a very serious conversation with yourself, because Bob Dylan is one of the most influential artists of all time. But for the sake of debate, you know, I'm going to give my thoughts on both of them. First of all, George Harrison was incredibly influential in one specific segment of music, and that is Indian music. Okay, he popularized it, he used it in a lot of different ways, in tracks like Norwegian Wood, for example. All of that, the instrumentation, you know, the sitar, was George Harrison's idea. You have things like Within You Without You and Sgt. Pepper's, Love You Too and Revolver, Blue Jay Way, and Magical Mystery Tour, tracks that introduced fans and the entirety of the US to a new style of music and allowed a lot of musicians from India to be known in the US, because obviously there's a lot of people in India that know how to use their music better than George Harrison. So you could say that he had a massive influence in this regard. As a guitarist, there's not a lot of things I can say about him in terms of influence. It wasn't really that groundbreaking when it comes to that. You know, the reason why people call him a genius is mainly because of his ability to write songs and to create beautiful melodies with the guitar, not for his guitar playing per se. When it comes to songwriting, he isn't really that influential either. Actually, he takes a lot of influence from people like Bob Dylan himself, and we'll get to that in a minute, so I can't really give him the point in this category against almost any artist. I mean, if this wasn't Bob Dylan, but Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, even people like Leonard Cohen, I can't really say that George Harrison is the winner because he wasn't really known for his influence. Most of the groundbreakingness, and the edgy instrumentation and songwriting came from the Lennon-McCartney duo, not really from George Harrison, which is why, even though I've said multiple times on this channel that the Beatles are the most influential band of all time, or among the most influential bands of all time, a lot of that doesn't really have anything to do with George Harrison. I love George Harrison. I don't want people to think that I'm a hater or anything like that. I'm not. I love the guy. I love his music, but we have to be honest here. Influence-wise, there's not a lot to say about George Harrison. Bob Dylan, on the other hand, we're talking about one of the most influential humans in the entire story of humanity, and I'm not even kidding. I mean, with the folk revival movement, he had massive influence in politics and in the way people wrote songs about protesting. And speaking about songwriting, we're probably looking at the most influential singer-songwriter in the history of music. No one wrote songs like Bob Dylan did. He basically wrote music and then built a track around the things he wrote, not the other way around, which is what you usually do, especially when you look at genres like rock and roll and pop music. You have a melody and then you write the song around the melody. Bob Dylan was the other way around, which means that sometimes songs sound kind of awkward and it's kind of claustrophobic, but that gives him this feeling of free willingness, and it allows the performance to feel more honest and vulnerable, which is the reason why so many people like David Bowie, even Johnny Cash, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison himself took a lot of influence from Bob Dylan's work. So I can't imagine an alternate future where I can give the point to George Harrison in this category, because once again, only when you look at songwriting, he's already incredibly influential. And then when you go to performance, the fact that he couldn't really sing that well, but still a lot of people enjoyed his performance because of how much passion and honesty was behind it, it was massively influential too. I believe that we wouldn't have albums like Plastic Ono Band, All Things Must Pass, or records, for example, like Joni Mitchell's Blue, if it wasn't for Bob Dylan. A lot of people may say that I'm exaggerating, but honestly, look back at music at the time and find me another person that was writing songs like Bob Dylan. You're probably not going to find anyone. You have him being a massive figure for the folk rock movement. You have him being a massive figure for American music. When psychedelic was swiping the whole country, he was making albums like John Wesley Harding and selling a shit ton of albums, So it's just undeniable that the man had a massive footprint in music, especially in the 60s. When you go to the 70s, it kind of dies down, but once again, the 60s is more than enough for me to give the point to Dylan in this category too. Alright, so Dylan is taking the win in the video so far, so maybe that'll change in the next category. Alright, so let's take a look at George here for a minute. We have a man who has the voice of an angel, definitely. Listen to songs like Something, Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or My Sweet Lord, and you're gonna find that the guy knows how to sing very well. However, that's only true when it comes to the tone of his voice. When it comes to the vocal skills, actual technical ability, or passion behind the performances too, and I'll get to that in a minute, he doesn't really have a lot to show. Some of you are probably gonna hate me for this, but listen, as a man that has listened to every single album the guy has released, I can tell you for a fact that he always sings in the same tune or very similar to the one you just heard a track ago, so he doesn't really have a lot of versatility. He can't really reach high notes, no really low notes like McCartney liked to do, in albums like Graham. It seems like the performance is constantly relying on the beauty of the melody or the euphoria of the melody rather than George Harrison's actual performance. I'm not complaining here, you don't really need to perform that well in order to make a good song. Again, he has an amazing discography, especially when you look at albums like All Things Must Pass. It's not that I believe that you need to be an amazing performer in order to do a good song. I don't really think that. He has a really good discography. Songs like Taxman or Long Long Long, for example, show that he can be passionate when he wants to. He can add a little more punch to his performance, but he just apparently chooses not to. But when it comes to Bob Dylan, even though a lot of us, including myself, can agree that he doesn't have the most melodic voice, the man can sing, and this is something a lot of people don't know. I think he's a very underrated singer. People think that it's just passion and honesty behind his voice, but he has a lot of technical skill too. If you want an example of this, just listen to his early folk tunes in 1964, his live performances, like the Newport Folk Festival. You can also go to the live performance of One More Cup of Coffee, which is one of my personal favorite live performances from him. His voice was at its best, in that performance. I absolutely love it. But it's clear to me that a lot of people just believe or see Dylan as a performer rather than an actual singer, and that is a complete mistake. Maybe today is different. Of course, the man aged already and his voice sounds horrible, and he manages to compensate with great songwriting, but that's a topic for another day. What I'm trying to say here is that Dylan doesn't only have passion, doesn't only have versatility and creativity at the time of performing, he also has a very impressive amount of vocal skills. Okay, I'm not saying that he can reach the highest note that Freddie Mercury can reach, for example, or Paul McCartney or Elvis, but the man clearly knows how to pull off a tune in the right way. He just chooses not to in order to sound more relatable and honest, because that's the main thing about Bob Dylan as a performer. The guy wants to make sure you understand what he's trying to say. He wants you to feel the same things he's feeling, and for the most part he succeeds. Blood on the Tracks, for example, is an album that has some of my favorite performances of all time in the form of Shelter from the Storm, Idiot Wind, Tangled Up in Blue. Bob Dylan is 100% going to take the win, no matter the context, no matter the song we're talking about. Yes, Bob Dylan's voice doesn't sound as pretty as that of George Harrison's, but he compensates with incredible creativity, passion, and way better vocal technique. Okay, so yeah, just look at both live performances from a song like If Not For You, and you're going to find a massive difference between the two. Alright, so far it looks like I'm giving the point to Bob Dylan in every single category, but discography is going to be way more interesting because we have quite a few things to consider before we pick a winner. Bob Dylan has one of the greatest discographies of all time. I mean, we're talking about 40 studio albums, out of which I'm pretty sure that 20 of them are above average in terms of quality. But we have George Harrison, and George Harrison, as I said multiple times throughout this video, and as I'm pretty sure you're well aware of, he was a former member of the Beatles, which I've said multiple times on this channel have the best discography of all time. Revolver, Abbey Road, The White Album, Let It Be, Sgt. Pepper's, Rubber Soul. I can keep going for the entire fucking day, mentioning every single album I love from the Beatles, because I'm going to name every single one of them. Every single one of the Beatles album is amazing. And as a solo artist, he has quite a few albums that are enjoyable. For example, the amazing All Things Must Pass, in my opinion, one of the best solo releases by the Beatles. You have Living in the Material World, which is a very underrated album. Dark Horse, even though it's not really that enjoyable, I think the experimentation that album offers is really, really interesting, way more interesting than a lot of the things that Bob Dylan was doing throughout the 70s. And if you ask me, Cloud 9 is at the same level of an album like Living in the Material World. A lot of people underrate that album. Brainwashed is also an incredible record, and a clear evidence that posthumous records can be really good if they were pretty much completed by the time the artist passed away. So to answer the question, which of the two has the best discography, we first have to decide how much of the Beatles' discography should be credited to George Harrison. And me personally, and I know a lot of people are going to hate me for this, because this is pretty much the reason why George Harrison left the Beatles. For me, I think that most of the Beatles' discography has to be credited to Lennon McCartney, because George Harrison did contribute to a lot of great songs. I Need You, Something, Here Comes the Sun, some of the greatest songs by the band. But you can't really ignore the fact that McCartney and Lennon towered over George Harrison in terms of creativity. Most groundbreaking moments by the band came out of the Lennon McCartney duo, not really from George Harrison. Once again, the most influential thing that George Harrison did with the Beatles is called Within You, Without You, Love You Too, and Blue Jay Way. After that is beautiful tunes, really good songwriting, but nothing too crazy, at least in my opinion. You can differ if you want. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people will disagree with me, but if I have to pick a number, how much of the Beatles discography I want to give to George Harrison, I would say about 15%, 20%, which even then feels kind of generous. When it comes to Bob Dylan, the man performed, wrote, and even produced almost every single album he ever released. Not produced every single album, but he participated in the production in a lot of these records, especially the ones made by the very end of his career around the 2010s. So let's go through a few of the albums which, in my opinion, represent Bob Dylan's best. Okay, so we have Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, Blonde on Blonde, John Wesley Harding, Blood on the Tracks, Desire, The Basement Tapes with the band. I mean, if you want to give Dylan 50% of that, then go ahead and do that, but it's still an amazing album and it's still a great achievement. Time Out of Mind in 1997. You have Love and Theft in 2001, Modern Times in 2006. Then you have Tempest in 2012. You have Rough and Righty Ways in 2020, which is a very underrated album. I absolutely love that record. Such amazing pieces of music no matter the decade, and a lot of the worst albums by Dylan were basically explorations that led the artist to a lot of the comebacks he did in the 80s with albums like Oh Mercy, or in the 90s with albums like Time Out of Mind. You know, you have good albums in the 60s, good albums in the 70s, good albums in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, and hopefully 2020s, you know. So if George Harrison had more credit for the Beatles' discography, and we talked about this in the Paul McCartney versus Bob Dylan video I uploaded like a year ago or something like that, I said that, you know, every single Beatles album after Rubber Soul beats every single album Bob Dylan has ever released. But since we're only giving a small amount of credit to George Harrison, because in my opinion that's what he deserves, it's kind of like annoying to having to separate the credit like that. You know, it was a band, all of them should have an equal amount, but if we're being honest, that's not how it works. I think Bob Dylan is the undeniable winner in this category. You know, his discography is just too good. George Harrison hasn't even come close to making an album as groundbreaking as Blonde on Blonde in terms of songwriting, or as honest, you know, and as heartfelt as Blood on the Tracks. So I hate to do this, but Dylan takes a point in this category as well. Now, I know how this video may have looked for a lot of people. It looks like I'm being incredibly biased and I love Bob Dylan and fuck George Harrison, but that's not really the way I feel. After listening to every single album both of them have to offer, not only as solo artists but also in their respective groups, like Bob Dylan with the band and George Harrison with the Beatles, I have to give the win to Bob Dylan. Like, it's impossible to give the point to George Harrison in any of these categories because Bob Dylan is way more popular. The name is way more popular than George Harrison. You know, Bob Dylan was more influential than George Harrison in any way, shape, or form, except when it comes to, you know, the psychedelic scene. And then when you go to performance, Bob Dylan's performance style is praised by people like David Bowie, Lou Reed, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison himself. Actually, I would go as far as to say, and I know this is kind of like an annoying thing to do, but I personally think that if George Harrison was still alive, he would say that Bob Dylan wins this entire video. Actually, every single time Bob Dylan's name touched, grazed George Harrison's mouth, it was always praising his songwriting, praising his performance, praising him as a human, you know. So personally, I believe that there's no other way this video could have ended, because unfortunately for me, George Harrison doesn't really have the catalog to offer Dylan a proper fight, you know. So even though I love George Harrison, I love his work, and I've enjoyed his music for many years, I have to say that Bob Dylan is the one that's going to win this video. However, that is only my personal opinion. I'm pretty sure you have your own, so go ahead and leave it down below in the comments. I'll make sure to check it out and give you my opinion on your opinion. I truly hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. Also, if you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, album, or artist, you can leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to fulfill requests as soon as I can. With that being said, once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.